A partner technology strategist. It's a very highfalutin title, but basically I work with a small subset of partners, and with those partners I go out to a larger set of customers like yourselves to talk about various different technologies. Today I'm going to focus mainly on Azure, and a lot of this, as you would expect, is going to be about things that you could move into Azure. The one thing I would say is you don't have to move everything. There's also the hybrid element, and Kenny, straight after me, is going to be talking a little bit more about that as well. So certainly don't think it has to be everything that you need to move into Azure. The other thing I kind of realise as I speak to people in my role is that actually people are at different stages, and it's one of the hardest things ever to try and do a presentation where you work for everybody. So there's three kind of main things that I'm going to try and cover for you today. That's what to move if you're wondering what to move into Azure, and if it's going to be your first kind of workloads to move. There's hopefully something in there for you with that. If you've moved stuff into Azure, what are you going to go and do next? What are the next things to go think about? And then finally, a very quick piece on security, because it was kind of mentioned it is very important, obviously, especially now. So hopefully almost like a shopping list, milestones, I think was the word that was mentioned to give you an idea. And so it was kind of shown much better in a video than I possibly would kind of cover it here. So I'll blast through this one pretty quickly. But actually, when we at Microsoft are talking to organizations and have done some research, we noticed there's a few kind of core things, priorities and concerns of businesses. The one of them is they need to grow, obviously. So when anything goes horribly wrong or bad within the world, there's two opportunities, right? You can either kind of hunker down with what you need to go do, or you can use it as an opportunity to grow. And so hopefully from this, you'll get a good idea of some of the things you could do to help with that kind of growth element, as well as obviously profit at the same time. Now, almost all of these were mentioned in that video. So as I say, I won't kind of labour on it for too long, but the thing that I see most out of all of this is probably actually talent shortage. So as well as talking about Azure, I talk to people about business applications and some of the Dynamics products we have. There's, as well as Dynamics, Azure has a massive talent shortage. And so one of the things I suggest to any small organization is if you're unable or not sure how to do this yourself, then really work with the people that have that talent already. And that's the partner that we're here with today, right? Computer World. So certainly where you think talent shortage might be an issue, you should be working with Computer World in order to kind of address that in some sense. And so actually, where I like to think technology helps in this instance is there are these four kind of SMB priorities. And for me, an SMB, actually for Microsoft, oddly enough, an SMB is something from, Bob's Fish and Chips, who is, one fish and chip fan, all the way up to larger organisations like for us, Holland and Barrett, and a number of the other organisations that you saw today. And so hopefully what you see today is going to kind of give you a good idea of, although these might be SMB priorities and you don't maybe think of yourself as an SMB, all of these are the sort of things that we see your organisations having to think about, and I'm going to concentrate on the far right-hand side. So we realise that you need to grow your business and make you more efficient. That tends to lean towards more the sides of things like Dynamics and M365. That's not what I'm going to cover today. The M365 stuff is in the other room. Keeping staff engaged and productive. As you would imagine, that kind of leans towards the idea of teams in the main instance. But really what I want to cover around here is the enhance your digital security and how that involves both the security suite that we have, but also Azure itself. Migrating from stuff that was traditionally on-premise into either the cloud fully or with the help of Kenny in a hybrid sense as well. And so when I go through these, I'm quite conscious, especially for the more technical people. So I'm half marketing, so I have a marketing past at least, half marketing and half technical. So there's a bit of me that kind of needs to know the positioning and the understanding of why we're doing this. And then there's the other bit that just says, that's a load of crud, just tell me what technology I need to go by. And so hopefully this gives you a good kind of rounding as to the technologies that we're kind of talking about here. So the keeping staff productive and engaged, you're going to hear more about that from James Graham in his piece later on today. But I kind of want to go into this piece here. Now, it does mention business premiums, M365, but actually, for digital security, a lot of the solutions that are going to help you be more secure are sitting in Azure themselves. And it's moving not only the stuff that is on-premise into Azure, but then ensuring that you're kind of securing it correctly as well. So if we see that kind of, we've taken the high-level things that are affecting us at the minute. We've then converted that into some priorities that hopefully resonate with some of you. And then there are the technologies that they need to do. So to get to the crux of it, what to do first? So where do you start if you're thinking of going into Azure? So just a show of hands. I'm going to put my hand up because it shows people what to do. Show of hands of people who have not put anything in Azure as yet. Okay, it's about a quarter of the room. Okay, cool. So this maybe is more of a focus for you guys, but for the rest of you, perhaps it gives you an idea of something that you might focus on next to go do. And so in marketing terms, we try and take all of the different things that you could use within Azure. There's over like 140 products, and condense them down into these groups of things that you would go focus on next. So the first is just basically the migration and modernization of the infrastructure that you have. So taking the Windows servers, SQL servers that are currently sitting in your data center or on-premise in some form, and thinking about how you can move those into Azure. The next is to take some of the other systems that you might have, so they might not necessarily be a Microsoft SQL database, for example, and it might not be a Microsoft operating system. And so where you have Linux, moving those into Azure as well. And then the other part is actually taking, in some sense, the VDI infrastructure that you've had. So where perhaps with COVID, you've suddenly spun up a VDI solution on-premise. So I've seen a lot of that with our partners and our customers setting that up. Once you've created the VDI infrastructure, the next kind of thing is to move that into AVD sitting in Azure. The whole idea being is that within Azure, at least with us, with help from your partner, you're able to run them a lot more efficiently and actually be able to run them with us taking more of the workload off of the managing of it, and you just deciding on what environment you want people to connect into. So the first thing is basically move your infrastructure, or your mess for less, as some people say. The next bit that you might want to think about is actually protecting the infrastructure once it's there. And so one route that you might need to go down, or you may wish to go down, is to use Azure Backup. If not Azure Backup, using some of our partner solutions that will also back up stuff that's in Azure itself. But Azure Backup might be the next thing that you kind of focus on in order to be able to ensure what is sitting in Azure, or even what's sitting on-premise still, is backed up, or at least has some form of redundancy. And ASR, so Azure Site Recovery, is the other way in which you can do that. So have an instance sitting in Azure that you can quickly use should your production environment disappear. That's also the way in which some people will actually move it as well. And the next is taking the data that's sitting on-premise and moving that into data in Azure. And that could simply be a database, or that could be a backup, moving that information that sits on-premise into Azure. The next piece that I wanted to go into is actually the migration and modernization. So it's kind of good that you've moved everything over, or it's hopefully a good thing that you've moved everything over. And sometimes, like kind of people refer to that as your mess for less. So it was in one place, you've now migrated it into Azure, but it's pretty much doing the same thing. And in a lot of instances, people tend to not even bother changing the type or the power of the machine that it's running on. They've just literally lifted and shifted it over. So once you've moved everything over into Azure, the next thing that you maybe go do is to try and pull apart the technology that you've moved over and actually think of a better way of running it. So rather than migrating or having a SQL server either sitting in Azure or sitting in sitting on premise or in Azure, maybe look to migrate it into a SQL instance. Or even SQL IaaS, but basically moving it into an instance sitting in Azure that we're able, with the help of the partner, to manage that data for you. I've just realised I've got the same bit there twice. The next bit is actually for analytics. So once that data has been moved over, thinking of actually how can you use that data better. And so within Azure, you're able to move some of that data into a data warehouse and then actually use analytics in various different forms to be able to kind of glean more information from that data. It might be using something as simple as Power BI, or it might be something as more advanced as using Azure Analytics. You may even go as far as to layer some AI over the top of it. The idea being is you've moved your data from on-premise into Azure, and then start thinking about actually how can you use some of the analytics workloads sitting in Azure to be able to further make use of that particular data that you have. The other thing that, to be honest, I see happen less, but is entirely possible, is this innovate and scale with cloud-native apps. So there are, where you've developed something yourself, so you've got an application you've developed, or maybe you're working with an ISV, an independent software vendor that's developed something, there is always the ability to, again, rather than just lift and shift it over, so you're mess for less, maybe you start to pick that apart, either because you've coded it yourself or with the ISV, to actually move it into the different serverless parts of Azure. And that's kind of where the cloud-native apps piece comes in. So a good example of that recently, which kind of was an interesting one to see, is I had a partner who had a customer that wants to move their stuff into Azure. And currently, their application runs on a virtual desktop. That virtual desktop is kind of running on-premise for them at the minute. They want to move that into Azure. They simply wanted to lift and shift it over. The odd thing being is actually all their customers that use the solution appear to be in their same Active Directory, and for anyone that knows that's a bad thing, that seems to be a bad thing, rather than separate it out. But they wanted to migrate that over. And actually, the conversation we had with them was necessarily maybe the better idea is rather than people externally accessing your application now via a remote desktop that sits in Azure, maybe you could rewrite the code to rewrite the application so it runs in a web page. Now, oddly enough, that's not something they started to do as yet, but running it in a web page would be a good example of them kind of ripping the code that they have and how they want it to work currently, and then moving it into using cloud-native apps. So moving from simply running in a virtual machine to running in a cloud-native app instead. So hopefully you can see from that, there might be, once you've moved your stuff over, if there are any applications you have control over that you've created, maybe you start to think about how I could make them into a cloud-native app as well. And then the last piece that I wanted to talk about here was actually, what do you do once that's all there? So what do I do now was the migrate piece. What do I do next is was the second piece there. So modernising of where the data is stored and the cloud native app space. But the third, perhaps for anyone who's South African, the now thing that you go do is actually securing the infrastructure. So as you got from earlier on, there's lots of things we need to worry about. Lots of people now attempting to kind of hack into the systems that people are running. And actually, cloud, although a great thing to kind of make it available to everybody, you need to be thinking, how can I make this secure? And there are some basic things that you could go do. So whether that's M365, switching on things like MFA, or whether in Azure it's taking some of the steps that are suggested in the security score, all of these things are like an opportunity for you to ensure that the infrastructure you have is more secured. And there are 3 or so things that I just want to quickly highlight that I would say is the now thing that you need to go do for any cloud native app. So the first thing is turn on the security score. So for those that have Azure, show of hands who's looked at the security score. Excellent, good, cool. It's about half the room. Let's assume the other half on Azure. That's good. So turn on the security score, start looking at the security score, and it's going to work with Computer World in order to understand what you're going to do around the security score to remediate any of the suggestions it has. The next thing to do is go and turn on Defender for all cloud workloads. Where you're able to do that, go switch that on so you can start to have Defender both on-premise and in Azure. Start to secure the workloads that you have running in there. The third thing that's been suggested is actually go and turn on WAF and the denial of service protection for every website that you happen to be running in Azure. That will also be in these kind of security score suggestions as well. And then the fourth thing is turn on the Azure firewall for every subscription. And I would say these are the kind of 4 core things that you need to go do on your Azure subscription. Certainly turning on the secure score is the primary one, I would say, to be able to kind of have a good idea of if there's anything you need to remediate or to look at with regard to security. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of the kind of core stuff that you need to go do. Just to reiterate, there's some stuff that you could go do now, right? So think about what you can migrate into Azure. The second piece to go and think about is modernize what is sitting in Azure already. And then finally, but not the least thing to worry about, is actually thinking about how you can go and secure what's sitting in Azure currently. And with that, I'm going to hand back to you guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.